We are very excited. This is the second in our 2021 Patent School Psychologist as Change Agent series. And today, our session will focus on decision-making in a multi-tiered system of support with an emphasis on looking at literacy data, specifically using early literacy data and student growth percentiles. All of the materials for not only our session last week on disciplinary equity, our session today, but also our upcoming session next week for math data can be found on this Padlet. Our co-hosts are posting it in the chat for you. So just a few reminders, our session is scheduled to run from 8:30 until 11:45 this morning. We will take a 15-minute formal break. At the end of the session, I will provide a code that you will need to enter into a survey for those of you who are seeking credit. Please know that you must stay logged in for the entire time from a device such as a computer, iPad. You're not able to call in and get credit if you are seeking credit. So I'll just do a quick orientation for those of you who were able to join us last time. We had an excellent session on disciplinary equity. So you will find the handouts, the resources in these first two columns. Today's session, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenters here in 1 minute, you will find in these columns, and they are color coded in pink. So you'll find an attachment to the PowerPoint in the handouts. And then we will have some breakout rooms this morning to give you a chance to dig into some data and practice those skills. So there is a link to the Google folder, as well as a breakout room activity, and then some additional resources that our presenters will be mentioning this morning. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our MTSS statewide lead, Dr. Jen Collins, our MTSS Central Region Regional Lead, Mrs. Karen Brady, and our Patent East School Psychology Lead, Dr. Gina Spicknall-Cook. Welcome. We are so excited for this session today and glad everyone can join us.
Thanks, Erica. Hopefully you can see my screen. You should see a title slide, Enhancing Decision-Making Within Tiered Systems. And we want to welcome you on behalf of the MTSS initiative and Erica's leadership under the School Psychology Initiative. We're really pleased to have the expectation that more than 100 folks will be joining today. And we're really assuming that you're here to learn how to walk with and with your help, your problem-solving teams through the analysis of the health of your tiered system and help them to evaluate the health of each of the tiers. So what does that look like, and how can, in this session, how can specifically the use of student growth percentiles help you quickly assess where you are relative to the health of your tiered system. So just very quickly, our mission at Patent is to really build your capacity to serve all students, including students with disabilities, in the least restrictive environment. And that very much has to do with what we're doing today. So from about 8:30 to 10, we will be delving into what I just mentioned. We'll take a break, and then Karen will be picking up with individual goal setting and monitoring after the break, and then we'll end with implications for your role as school psychologist. We very much want to hear from you and see kind of where you are with all this information. So while in an effort to kind of get a sense of where you are now, if you could put in the chat the system, the universal screening system or benchmark system that your building or setting is using, that would be great. So if you could go ahead and put that into the chat box, we'll get a sense of who's using what. You might be using Acadian's Reading, you might be using Ames Web Plus, you might be using Dibble's 8th. And if one of my colleagues could just let me know after maybe another 30 seconds here or so what everyone's using, that'll be great.
So it looks like we have a lot of people using Acadience, some using FastBridge and iReady. We have some Dibbles 8, a few of those, Ames Web Plus, Star, iReady, Dibbles, Star. I think that's pretty much everything.
Great, great. Thank you, Erica. That's really helpful. And I think this will apply to mostly every system out there with the exception of FastBridge. I'm not sure if FastBridge currently has or yields student growth percentiles, but at least you'll get a sense of what this looks like in practice. And you might be able to extrapolate that to the information that you get within the FastBridge system. Before I get started, speaking of school psychologists as change agents, and I'm going to date myself here in a minute, but I wanted to let you know that this is about my 27th year in the field, and a long time ago, prior to or shortly after the National Reading Panel's report came out, there was a book that was strongly recommended by folks at the International Dyslexia Association conference in the early 2000s. And a book was specifically mentioned by Reed Lyon that really, for me, served as the impetus for change in practice. And so I wanted to share that book with you, and we did put it in the Padlet. It's called The Voice of Evidence in Reading Research. So while the National Reading Report, took the research and all of the studies, the meta-analyses across the building blocks and put that into the National Reading Report, what the Voice of Evidence did by Peggy McCardle and Vanita Chhabra was really contextualized the science of reading, which very much affects our practice as school psychologists, particularly within tiered systems. So if you want to go beyond the report and just get a little more context, the Voice of Evidence in Reading Research is, for me, was a game changer and is still very applicable to how we function today. I also included a recent synopsis on best practices in SLD research from Jack Fletcher, Dr. Jack Fletcher and Dr. Jerry Misiak. That was released about 2 springs ago, and it's about 60 pages. I'll reference that a little bit later, but that's also another good resource for school psychologists to review. And then I will give you an update a little bit later in the presentation on our status in Pennsylvania regarding our RTI SLD approval process. We have gotten some changes through the Bureau, and for us, and we hope you will find this as well, it's good news. So I did want to mention those as context for today. We're starting out here with MTSS and the undergirding of equity. And so this is a quote by McCart and Miller. Many of you know that the moral imperative undergirding a multi-tiered system of support has always been equitable access to high quality core instruction and related services and supports to kids when they need them, as they need them, within a flexible and fluid service delivery model. So we thought it was important to just remind folks that that has not changed. If anything, it's more heightened today than ever. And that we do have a relatively new resource through the PDE website called the PDE Equity Resource Hub. And so I've included that link for you. When you go to that hub, you will find myriad resources and articles and tools. So please get a chance to visit that and take a deeper dive into the Equity Hub. In Pennsylvania, we still retain some major components of a multi-tiered system of support. These are consolidated a bit. Our model in Pennsylvania actually has 8 framework components, and I pulled out multiple tiers of instruction and intervention, and I kind of made that really big because when we think about a multi-tiered system of support, agree with Mark Shin, it really comes back to the tiers and what we're doing in terms of standards aligned core instruction, and then again, those fluid and flexible services and supports that kids should be able to access through the advanced tiers. But in general, we're looking at a tiered system, obviously being guided by shared leadership, an infrastructure that supports fluid and flexible services, and gets teachers the tools that they need to do their job well. Communication and collaboration that can happen formally and informally on the fly. Using data to inform what we do almost on a daily, if not weekly basis. So a lot of formative data to guide instruction and intervention. And then all of this is interwoven within a continuous problem solving process. So we are constantly reminding the teams that we work with each year throughout the year within the various series that we offer that there is no finish line for comprehensive school improvement. I wish there were, but there's not. And so we're always working on continuous school improvement and systemic change guided by really the scientific method, a problem solving process. One of the things we continue to do, and we hope you'll also help us do, is help practitioners continue to fine tune their understanding between response to intervention and a multi-tiered system of support. So we really like the way Mark Shin operationalized the difference, and so we've borrowed this from him. We want folks to see multi-tiered systems as much broader than RTI, that when they think about a multi-tiered system of support, they're thinking about a framework that is designed to enhance social, emotional, behavioral, and academic outcomes for all students. So a general ed hospital that we continually strengthen through a cross-disciplinary effort. We think of RTI as the assessment process that occurs within a multi-tiered system of support to ascertain how kids are growing as a function of universal supports and then additional supports that they receive through the advanced tiers. And so we talk about RTI as a number of different methodologies. One is something that we've pushed in Pennsylvania for a long time, which is rate of improvement. Another would be mastery measurement. And more recently, now that it's built into the systems that we use, or has been built into the systems that we use, but not leveraged to the same degree, is the use of student growth percentiles. And that's our focus today. So just if you could put in the chat, if you feel there's still some confusion between RTI as an assessment process and multi-tiered systems of support. Do you see that there's still room to continue to revisit this difference with practitioners?
We are getting a lot of yeses with exclamation points.
Good. Okay, good. I'm glad we're not alone. I'm glad we have validation that others are saying that. Thank you. So I mentioned we have these series. What we found is that to bring a team of practitioners together around this effort of using data to inform the science of reading as it relates to knowledge and then enacting that knowledge in practice, we offer these year-long series. And our plans have not been approved for next year, but our series are still very much a part of the MTSS statewide plan. And one of the series that we offer that makes sense to tell you about today is called Enhancing Early Literacy Outcomes. And what teams do is they do what we're going to be doing today. They look at their fall to winter, we help them look at their fall to winter student growth percentiles, and then mobilize ways to robust up core reading instruction and then supplemental reading intervention matched to need. We also then help them to discern which kids look like they're proving to have both an intense need and a severe need in reading, who have not had an adequate response to instruction and intervention, and under child find need to be considered for eligibility determination. So that's what this series entails. And I just wanted to mention it to you because it comes with an application, and your colleagues would be trained in our partnership through University of Oregon in explicit instruction. So specifically, we have been piloting ECRI, Enhanced Core Reading Instruction. You can go to the ECRI website, which is part of University of Oregon, and take a look at some of the core reading programs whereby ECRI routines for phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocab, and comp have been embedded. So there's a short list right now, but it's growing. And if you're eligible, we would encourage you to apply for that series when you receive the application from your intermediate unit consultant. But these are the goals of that series, and this is what you, as the school psychologist, who we would love to see get highly involved, particularly at the tier 3 level, and then also in this data analysis piece to inform instruction intervention, we'd love to see you be a part of this team and apply. So let's get started into the content. We'll start off with just 2 questions. So the first question is, how do we assess the fidelity of tiers within a tiered system? How do we assess fidelity? How do we know, thumbs up, that there's fidelity of core instruction, there's fidelity of advanced tier intervention? How do we know? What are the look-fors? So go ahead and put your responses into the chat box if you would.
Okay, we're getting a few things in the chat. Not every student should need to be tested that is placed in tier 3. We need to look at progress monitoring data, direct observation, checklists, observe consistency of following the instructional scripts in tier 1, observation. We're working on fidelity for behavioral interventions. On the academic side, we use MAP growth class wide to assess tier 1. Can conduct fidelity checklists for core and assessing tier 1, use of evidence-based research interventions, look for patterns across a grade level, building district to see gaps in tier 1, observation with fidelity checklists to ensure all big 5 areas of reading are being instructed on for time appropriate per grade level, data, screening assessments, progress monitoring, fidelity checklist, determining percentage of students progressing toward benchmarks within each tier.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, and thanks for responding, everyone. And those responses are terrific. They're right on target. One of the systems level indices of a healthy tier and then overall a healthy tiered system, which we're going to emphasize today through SGP analysis, is that 80% marker. So when we think about how many students we want to respond adequately by meeting benchmark status on time, particularly at the K-2 level, we're talking about 80%. So we're exposing 100% of students to high quality, standards aligned core reading instruction, because we're talking about reading today. And then we want minimally 80% of students to reach benchmark on time, just with access to high quality core instruction alone. The same applies for advanced tier support. If advanced tier reading intervention is adequately and appropriately matched to need, sufficient level of intensity, sufficient dosage, sufficient fidelity, sufficient match, we also should see that 80% of students who are receiving a tier 2 or a tier 3 support are responding adequately, as evidenced by what we call above typical growth. If they get well above typical growth, which some kids do, you know, we're doing cartwheels over that, but minimally over a reasonable period of time, we want all of those students who are getting a tier 2 or a tier 3 support to respond with above typical growth, about 80%. So if you're approaching that 80% mark, 80% of kids are responding to high quality core instruction alone, as evidenced by meeting benchmark on time. And for those students who are receiving core plus advanced tier support, 80% of those students are responding with above typical growth. We have the synchronon of a healthy tiered system. So we know that if we enact the science of reading in terms of knowledge and then applied in practice within the confines of a tiered model, we end up with almost 0 to less than 2.5% of kids at the kindergarten level matriculating to first grade without any difficulties, meaning that with the right things in place, we can get almost, if not 100% of students to benchmark by the end of kindergarten and maintain those skills through first grade. Same thing with first grade. We're looking at less than about 4 to 6% of kids not responding to a healthy tiered system. So in essence, we have the answers for about all but 4 to 6%, particularly at the K-2 level. After we cross that threshold of second grade, it's a little bit harder. There's this window that seems to come down where we enter the land of remediation, so it takes twice as long. We can still get kids to proficiency status, but when we think about prevention and really maintaining the 80% mark and getting almost all kids to benchmark status by the end of their school year, we really want to be doing that for about 95% of kids. So look for 80%. If you're in a situation where you're ending up with a 60-40 split, where only 60% of your students are meeting benchmark on time in winter and then in spring, then you're what Roland Good considers approximating effectiveness. So if you're fluctuating somewhere between 60 and 80% of kids meeting benchmark on time, you're doing well. If you're below that, then there's really some robust work to be done. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And again, all the things that you mentioned around assessing fidelity help to corroborate or confirm how you got to that 80% mark. And then I mentioned, are you familiar with the RTI methodology of, I mentioned student growth percentiles. Could I ask you to put in the chat on a 0 to 1, 0 if you know nothing about student growth percentiles at this point, and a 1 if you're comfortable with SGPs. So where are you with your understanding of SGPs? A 0 or a 1?
We have a lot of zeros, we have a few ones, and I can tell we have a lot of school psychologists here because we have some that are rating themselves as a 0.5. Quite precise.
Love it, love
Yes.
it, love it. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So let's just talk conceptually about what student growth percentiles are. And I'm going to read directly from the slide and then elaborate. So a student growth percentile, or SGP for short, because it's a really long clause, compares a student's growth to that of his or her academic peers nationwide. A student growth percentile compares a student's growth to that of his or her, and we could add like, academically like peers nationwide. So academically like peers are kids in the same grade with a similar scaled score and or beginning benchmark composite based upon the fall benchmark assessment. So if Karen and I were in the same grade and we were both first grade students and we took the fall benchmark assessment and we both performed in the red range, in the well below benchmark status range at the beginning of first grade, we would be considered to be academically like peers. And when you use SGPs, we wouldn't be comparing Jen and Karen to Erica, who might have performed at benchmark or above benchmark on the fall assessment. We would be comparing Jen and Karen to Jen and Karen and other kids who start out like Jen and Karen as it relates to adequate or inadequate response to intervention, AKA growth. And ultimately what we want for Jen and Karen, who start out in that well below benchmark or red range, is for Jen and Karen to have above typical growth from time 1 to time 2, which in this case would be fall to winter. And if Jen proves to not have above typical growth and Karen does, and so do 3 other of our academically like peers who are getting tier 1 and that advanced tier support, then Jen is the student who looks like the outlier, because we can say most of the kids who are getting that core and advanced tier intervention are responding with above typical growth. So I'll continue to elaborate on that, but that is basically the concept of SGPs. Just want to add that SGPs are reported on a 1 to 99 scale, and with lower numbers indicating lower relative growth, higher numbers indicating higher relative growth. So if a student has an SGP of 90, and your various reports, depending on the system that you're using, will give you a number, or they will give you a color. In Acadience, you get a color and then you get a descriptor. What an SGP of 90 means is that the student has shown more growth than 90% of his or her academically like peers. Now, an SGP of 90 is very, very high. We don't see that very often. We'd love to see it, but that's considered to be a pretty high rate of growth. What most of the systems will tell you in which you're operating is that if your kids who are showing risk are getting SGPs of somewhere between 50 and 65, depending on the system you're using, that is considered to be above typical growth. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for kids to have SGPs from time 1 to time 2, or winter to spring, which would be time 2 to time 3, or even fall to spring, although that's a really long period of time to wait to move kids to referral. So we're looking at one of fall to winter or winter to spring to gauge adequate or inadequate response to intervention. And one way to do that is to look at the SGPs from time 1 to time 2. So again, the range we're looking at minimally for kids who are at risk would be in that 50 to 65 range. That typically connotes above typical growth. Well above typical growth is somewhere usually above 70. So I'm just going to pause there and just make sure we're good with that, with what's on the slide so far. This will become clear as we look at reports. So Erica, just a thumbs up if everyone's okay with that.
Nothing in the chat at this time.
Okay, great. So what would this look like if you were to, begin to put this sort of RTI language, if you begin to capture that for teams of practitioners when we're trying to figure out which students are showing what Jack Fletcher calls that intractability, which is indicative in many cases of kids who have bona fide reading disabilities. And intractability means we're pouring the medicine into kids and everyone seems to be responding as evidenced by above typical growth. With the exception of Jen. She continues to remain well below average in terms of level, and her growth from time 1 to time 2 has been in the 10s or 20s, meaning that she's exhibited well below typical growth from time 1 to time 2. So let's put this into practice. And so on the left-hand side, what you hopefully see and agree upon is that we have 5 kids here. These are my colleagues, they let me borrow them, who are all falling well below benchmark. So we have myself, I'm at the first percentile. When we converted my reading composite on Acadience, it equated to the first percentile. Karen was at the 10th, Jared was at the 6th, Erica was at the 3rd, Drew was at the 5th. And so we were red flagged automatically based on this performance for 90 minutes of core reading instruction plus a tier 3 level of support. And we then received that in fall, and then in winter, we were being progress monitored in between, and then from winter, we took the benchmark assessment in winter, and you can then get our SGPs. And so my rate of improvement from fall to winter was about 1.5, and we'll just pretend this is nonsense word fluency or correct letter sounds. That converted to an SGP of 10, which is considered well below typical growth. So WBT means well below typical growth. Karen, who was at the 10th percentile from fall to winter, had a rate of improvement of about 2.0 correct letter sounds per minute per week. That converted to an SGP of 20, which is still below typical growth. So Karen is growing better than I am, but she's still evidencing below typical growth. So we're not happy with that. Again, we want Jen and Karen to minimally have above typical growth. Jared, who's at the 6th percentile, his rate of improvement from fall to winter was 3.4 correct letter sounds per minute per week, which converted to an SGP of 40. And that's right below that threshold of above typical growth, which is somewhere, again, depending on the system you're using, between about 50 and 65. And so we're not quite happy with 40, but that's certainly better growth than Jen or Karen. And if we had to think about which kids are looking like they're really at risk sitting in the emergency room, I would obviously be first on the list based on at least these 3 kids so far. Erica, who started out at the 3rd percentile, really very close to where I started, had a rate of improvement, wow, of 7.0 correct letter sounds per minute per week. That converts to an SGP of 80. Again, we don't always see this, but that says that Erica really responded to what was happening in core, plus her tier 3 support and service. She evidenced well above typical growth. So WAT is well above typical growth from fall to winter. And then Drew, the last of my academically like peers, started out at the 5th percentile. From fall to winter, he evidenced 5.5 correct letter sounds per minute per week. His SGP was 60 from fall to winter, and that is above typical growth. That's exactly minimally where we wanted all of these kids to be, with Erica being the high flyer with well above typical growth. So one of the things you want to do, though, is out of groups of kids who are receiving similar tier 3 supports, and I'm, for the sake of argument, I'm saying that we all received the same tier 3 support. how many of us are responding with above typical growth as a function of that tier 3 support. And in this case, we didn't hit that 80% mark. We only have 3 out of the 5 students evidencing minimally above typical growth. So we only have Erica and Drew evidencing above typical or well above typical growth. The rest of us did not quite meet that goal. And so we would say that there's room to improve fidelity of whatever we're doing in the advanced tiers. And, you know, it would tell you that after meeting with a lot of our teams this year who were steeped in mobilizing effective supports to robust up core reading instruction plus tier 3 supports, people have traditionally struggled and continue to struggle with the match at tier 3 and getting that 80% of fidelity. So seeing that most kids are responding to that tier 3 support, we are not quite there yet. We find that there's room to expand the continuum of interventions that are offered at tier 3, and there's room to kind of have people reflect on the intensity of what's happening at tier 2 versus what's happening at tier 3, which should be different. So factors related to dosage, time, the match, the tools that we're using at tier 3 all help reading specialists who are doing most of the work here approximate faster this 80% goal. So if we had 3 of these kids or 4 of these kids getting above typical growth, we would feel a little bit better about fidelity of tier 3, but in this case, we're not quite there. The way we would write this up, if we were focused on Drew, for example, and interpreting Drew's response to intervention for Drew's family at a tier 3 problem solving meeting it might sound something like this, or in a report. In comparison to his like academic peers, Drew had an SGP of 60 and demonstrated more growth than 60% of his academically like peers. Therefore, Drew's RTI, or response to intervention or responsiveness to intervention, is considered to be above typical and adequate at this time. So that's how that would look in writing, and if we would say it verbally to a family to begin to help interpret what this means. If we had to interpret Jen's SGP, the way we would phrase that is we would say Jen had an SGP of 10, meaning that Jen demonstrated less growth than 90% of her academically like peers from fall to winter. Therefore, Jen's responsiveness to intervention is considered to be inadequate or well below typical at this time. So, any questions about how you would interpret these? And let me ask you to try one. How might you interpret Jared's response? How might you interpret Jared's response? And feel free to use this phraseology down here and put it in the chat box. Not all of this, but maybe down here, how would you summarize his RTI? Hopefully we have some brave souls out there.
We have one thus far, Jen.
That person gets a prize.
Considered to be below typical and requires more intensive intervention. Yeah. So, you know, we might say that we might contextualize it by saying what you said, which is the response is below typical. There's room to intensify, and there's room to intensify for all students, right? In Jared's group, because we didn't hit that 80% mark. So he's approaching
And an adequate response as evidenced by above typical growth, he's right there. So we would engage the problem solving team, including the family, in some things that we can do to intensify and try to get that above typical growth. So he's pretty close. Yeah, good. Whoever that was, thank you.
And we had a couple more pop in.
Okay.
Jared demonstrated more growth than 40% of his academically like peers. His RTI is considered to be below typical and would benefit from further intervention.
Nice.
And then another one, while Jared's RTI is below typical growth, he is demonstrating relative growth.
Yeah, nice. Very nice. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, so that sets the stage for what we're going to do now. And I believe in the Padlet that Erica shared, you will see some mock data that looks like this. And you'll want to open that up and follow along with me, because what I want to do is take you through a protocol that we take teams through. And typically school psychologists are part of the teams, but ultimately we'd love for every school psychologist to be able to shepherd teams through this, particularly when we get the spring data, which hopefully is coming up for many teams in May. And also then in winter, when you get your fall to winter SGPs. But this is pretty easy to empower practitioners, classroom teachers, and then also people who function in the advanced tiers, primarily reading specialists and also special education teachers, to interpret so that they're able to continually assess the health of tier 1 core reading instruction for their kids, plus the health of the advanced tiers. So you being able to lead this process, we think is invaluable. So I hope you can see this. I think I could make it just a little bit bigger. Not much, or I'll lose the key. That might be too much. Let me see here.
Jen, I'm still seeing your PowerPoint.
Okay, let me show you, sorry. Thank you, what you should be looking at. So this is what is in your, are you seeing it now, Karen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, great, thank you. So let me put it at 70, let me put it at, let's see, 85%. Okay, that's about as big as I can make it without losing the key at the bottom. So a couple notes about moving into next year, really any year, COVID, no COVID. These are some considerations when you work with your data teams. Your spring data is always your most reliable data. And so when you go to collect that in May and you do your final benchmark assessment, you will want to use that or encourage your teams and administrators to use that to inform who gets advanced tier supports and services day 1 of the 21-22 school year, week 1 or week 2, who gets those advanced tier services and supports based on that spring data. All you're doing with the fall data is you're corroborating how kids left in the spring. That's basically what you're doing with fall data. And with all kids, first graders on up, you want to allow and encourage your teams to allow for a month of recoupment time. So all kids coming in the fall of 21-22 need a good month on average. It could be somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 weeks to recoup skills learned from the prior year. Kindergarten students always need a good 4 to 6 weeks of instruction before we screen them in the fall. So essentially, you're using end of year data for kids who are going to first grade, going to second grade, and so on to inform what they're going to get moving forward. And for kindergarten students and all other students, you're waiting until usually about mid-October to late October to do that fall benchmarking. So I just want to ask if that makes sense and if people are currently doing that, or if you might not know. I hope you know, but are people currently doing that? Does spring data serve to inform what kids are going to get in the next grade level? Are people able to interpret the spring data and then put those supports and services in place, and also use the spring data to inform what the grade level needs in terms of enhancing core instruction?
We have some yeses and some it's being used inconsistently, but maybe not with all grades.
Okay, great. Great. That's great news. Glad to hear that. So this is a really busy report. I think upon visual glance, when you first see it, people are a little, a little overwhelmed. So just bear with me, because this is exactly how we do it step by step with teams. And so the first thing we do is we orient the teams. This is first grade classroom, and we'll call this Mrs. Smith's classroom. So the first thing we do is we orient the team to Mrs. Smith's classroom and her level data. And this is beginning of the year, how each student performed at the beginning of first grade. And let's pretend there was a month of recoupment time. So let's pretend that we've done our best to kind of weed out false positives and negatives, and that these kids, this is where they left kindergarten because they're now entering into first grade, and this is where they are. So, and they're truly here in terms of performance. So there are no false positives or negatives here. So what we do is we just simply add up the number of students. So if someone could add up the number of students in Mrs. Smith's class, that would be great. Let me know how many there are.
$17.
Okay, 17. Out of Mrs. Smith's 17 first grade students, I want you to tell me how many of the 17 performed at benchmark or above benchmark of the 17. How many of the 17 were at benchmark or above benchmark? So you're looking for the number of dark squares and dark triangles.
Okay, we're seeing a lot of 8s.
Good. So now I want you to tell me what percentage of 17 8 is. What percentage is that? What percentage of Mrs. Smith's class left kindergarten as a function of a year in kindergarten meeting proficiency? That is responding to tier 1 and any other supports that were given in kindergarten. What percentage? Because we've allowed for recoupment time.
47.
47%. So what you should be thinking to yourself is, that's not quite the mark we were hoping for. Half the class is still not at that minimum threshold, which would be at benchmark status. That is the lowest threshold that we want all children, including the lowest performing students, to get to at every benchmark assessment period. So we have 50% of kids who are distributed between below benchmark and well below benchmark status. And so what that says to me, if I'm working with a team, is we need to take a look at what's happening in kindergarten, because there's room to look at the health of tier 1 or universal practices in kindergarten, and what's happening in advanced tier support with kindergarten students over the course of their kindergarten year, to approximate 100%, but minimally that 80% who are responding just to kindergarten core instruction alone. So that's what that tells me. Okay, so now what we want to do is, we know that 8 out of the 17 are at benchmark or above benchmark. And if I'm doing my math right, that means that 9 out of the 17 are distributed between below benchmark and well below benchmark status. So we want to do to assess the health from fall to winter of core instruction is we want to kind of assume that kids who are above benchmark or at benchmark in fall are not going to receive a tier 2 or a tier 3 support. They don't need that. And so what we want to make sure is that from time 1 to time 2, that they stay where they are. They maintain their relative standing, which means that they have gotten typical growth from time 1 to time 2, which in this case is fall to winter. So in order to assess that, you really just start with the 8 kids who were at benchmark or above benchmark, and we'll start with Elena because she was one of them and she's right here at the top. And you just go straight across and you see her reading composite score, which doesn't tell you nothing until it's interpreted as above benchmark, at benchmark, below benchmark, or well below benchmark. And did she retain her relative status from time 1 to time 2? You just put yes or no in the chat box. Are we getting yeses, Erica?
We aren't getting anything. Wait. Yes.
Okay. So what I want you to do now is I want you to add up. I want you to look at those 8 kids in the fall who were at benchmark or above benchmark. I want you to tell me how many of the 8 either maintained their relative standing as measured by typical growth or increased their relative standing. They got above typical or well above typical growth as a function of core reading instruction. How many of the 8? So the question again is what percentage? Go ahead, Erica.
They're saying all 8.
100%, exactly.
100%.
So what would you say about the health of core instruction for those 8 students? Do we have a healthy tier 1 for those 8 kids?
Yes, we're getting lots of yeses. Core is working.
Yes, very good. Now, let's take a look at the 9 students who started out the year, beginning of year, in the below benchmark, half solid, half empty square, or below or well below benchmark status. How many of those 9 students from time 1 to time 2, beginning of year to this says end of year. Sorry, I was saying winter. This is end of year, beginning of year to end of year, had above typical or well above typical growth. Remember, we said the minimum criteria that we're looking to say, yep, the instructional diet that we have in place for students who are at risk needs to yield minimally above typical growth. So how many out of the 9 realized above typical or well above typical growth from time 1 to time 2? What are we getting, Erica?
We're getting silence right now. May need a little help, Jen. Nothing yet in the chat.
Wait
All
a
right,
minute.
we're getting some 4s. They're popping in. We've got 44%.
All right, let's go over this together because I'm getting 6 out of 9. I'm getting out of the 9 students who were below benchmark or well below benchmark. I'm seeing that 6 out of the 9. So let's go through this. So the first kid is Artie. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on, so I think it's Artie. So did Artie did Artie evidence above typical or well above typical growth from time 1 to time 2? The answer is no, right? He evidenced well below typical growth, or I'm sorry, below typical growth, which is 2 yellow stars, well below typical growth from time 1 to time 2. So Artie's doesn't count. He did not make above typical or well above typical growth. Then we have the next kid, who's Alexia. She evidenced well above typical growth from time 1 to time 2. So if I go straight across, she responded to core instruction plus her, let's say, tier 3, because she was well below benchmark. So I'd be mobilizing a tier 3 for her. And so she goes in the column well above or above typical. Then we have Delphine, well above typical. Great. We have Delilah, didn't quite respond the way we wanted to. She evidenced below typical growth. So she's with Artie. Frida, well above typical growth, 5 blue stars. Pearl, typical growth, not quite there. Renata, well below typical growth. Whitney, well below typical growth. And Winford, above typical growth, 4 green stars, exactly where we needed it. So we have 5 students who did not make above typical growth out of 9. And if you do the calculations, that is 55% who did not respond to core plus a tier 3 support, or in some cases, maybe a tier 2 support. So what would you conclude about the efficacy of advanced tier support in combination with what's happening at tier 1? What would you conclude? Go ahead and put your responses in the chat. Erica, what are we getting? Anything?
We are getting a variety of responses. So some room for improvement. Weak, needs to be more effective, good at tier 1, but not at tier 3. Need to consider the fidelity of tier 2 and 3 supports. It's not helping everyone. Needs to be more intensive.
Good. How many of the students who are receiving tier 2 or tier 3 support, how many needed to, how many of the 9 would have needed to realize above typical or well above typical growth in order for us to say there's fidelity across the tiers, that what we're doing in the advanced tiers is healthy. The kids who are receiving an advanced tier support, a tier 2 or tier 3, it's benefiting them. How many out of the 9? So hopefully you're saying 7.5 kids or so. So hopefully you're saying 7. So yeah, if 2 more of these 9 kids beyond the 5 were responding with above typical or well above typical growth, I think we could safely say, you know, we're good. Keep doing what you're doing. But in this case, we would say there's a little more room to improve fidelity of advanced tier support. Maybe we need to look at the match. Maybe we need to be more targeted. Maybe we need to be more comprehensive. It could be a variety of things. And that's what leads the conversation then toward those evidence-based practices matched to need. What I can also do if I'm leading a data meeting with this data is I can simply count up the number of kids who out of the 17 are responding to core plus supplemental intervention. And so I think we said that 100% of the kids, of the 8 kids who started out benchmark or above benchmark, maintained their relative standing or did even better. So that was 8. And then we said another 5, or we said another 4 are responding with above typical growth or well above typical growth. So that's 12 out of the 17 kids. And that gives me 71%. So is this a system just based on these 2 data sources, fall to winter, and these are SGPs, is this a system between tier 1 and the advanced tiers that you would say is approaching optimal effectiveness? And the system in this case is this classroom.
So we're having some approaching yes, but not quite there. Some yeses, working toward it.
Yeah. I mean, we would absolutely want to celebrate what's happening with most of the kids. And you're presuming that these practices are going to continue. Whatever they are doing, you're assuming that's going to continue uniformly throughout the year. In this case, we're looking at fall to summer, spring data, but in the systems that you're using, you'll be able to look at fall to winter progress and then winter to spring progress. And I know Acadians will have that eventually too. So this is really telling data. What you then want to do is help people kind of decipher what these colors mean. And I ask people to just, because visually this is overwhelming, I ask people to do the same thing that we've done with the stars, which is look for anything glaring in terms of a pattern. So, you know, sometimes we'll look at this middle section and we will see, you know, out of 17 kids, that most kids are evidencing green stars, dark green stars, or blue stars across all of the indices, meaning that teachers, whatever they're doing in terms of core reading instruction, what we're doing in supplemental intervention, they're doing something robust because the majority of kids have typical, above typical, or well above typical growth patterns, again, across these indices. So that would mean in this case, across beginning phonics skills, and across beginning to read words accurately and fluently in connected first grade text. That's what that would mean here from beginning to end of first grade. So that's what I see here. Do you all see a lot of blues and greens and then some dark greens here? What kind of patterns do you see? So I mentioned that we've looked at some reports where there are lots. What do you see here when you look at just the colors? And are there certain color or certain indices that you're concerned about because you see more yellows and reds? So go ahead and analyze that a little bit visually and then just put in the chat box some patterns that you see. And remember, this is first grade, beginning to end of year. And these pathways, below typical, well below typical, typical, above typical, and well above typical growth, represent the whole year here. These are end of year pathways. So we think about correct letter sounds. Let me just lead you a little bit, indicator by indicator. When you look at correct letter sounds, the ability to identify each letter in a 3-phoneme word mostly, and then do that accurately and with automaticity. What kind of patterns do you see with kids in this particular classroom from fall to spring? What kind of growth patterns do you see?
We did have a note for NWF, some reds and yellows are in there.
Yeah, I'm counting with reds here, reds and yellows, below typical and well below typical growth from fall to spring as it relates to identifying letters accurately and with relative ease in 3-phoneme words. I'm seeing a good 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids who still need work with what we would call beginning alphabet principal skill development, what we call phoneme grapheme correspondence. I'm seeing kids who need that, who did not acquire that skill, who on a week-to-week basis, despite being given core reading instruction and then presumably some supplemental intervention, there wasn't enough intensity for those 7 kids, which is a fairly high number of kids in this class. It's a good third in that area. So I'd be talking to this classroom teacher or this grade level, if this was what happened across all teachers in the grade level, we'd be talking about how to robust that particular skill through instruction at core and then also in advanced tier support. I'd also be saying that 7 out of 17 kids is a pretty realistic number. That each year we know that minimally 30–35% of kids struggle with learning phonics, beginning phonics in first grade. And their goal from beginning to middle of first grade is to establish phonics skills. And so we can count on every year with every cohort, a third needing very explicit instruction to do that. And so this pattern of a lot of below typical and well below typical growth under correct letter sounds indicates that that third is pretty tried and true. So you would ask teachers to go back and kind of look at reports retrospectively, which they can do, and see if that's the case. You know, was this unique to this cohort, or is this unique to instruction that we need to continue to look at and robust up in this area? How about whole words? So now this is looking at those short words and being able to recode them right away. So kids are no longer going sound by sound. They're looking at a nonsense word or a real word, in this case, a nonsense word, and they're saying it out loud and accurately as a whole word. What patterns do you see there? And hopefully what you're saying or seeing is that you're seeing, for a lot of kids, typical, above typical, and well above typical growth as it relates to being able to say words accurately and with relative automaticity. So if we had to boil this down for a classroom teacher and we had to say, what does that look like on a weekly basis if we were to progress monitor nonsense words, whole words read? That means that the average student in Mrs. Smith's classroom, many of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 out of 17 kids are recoding words accurately and with relative ease at about a rate of 1 to 2 correct whole words said per minute per week. So when we think about typical growth in this indicator for first graders, we're looking at 1 to 2 per minute per week. So the reds, you know, this kid, Renata, I hope I'm saying that right because I can't see Renalia. She is doing on a weekly basis more like no words. She's not able to recode any words at this point with a red, which is well below typical growth on a weekly basis. And then Whitney is also struggling. Maybe she's only able to recode a few words with this below typical. So she's well below that 1 to 2, which is what's typical for most first graders from fall to winter in this indicator. If you can hold in your head 1 to 2, that almost applies to typical growth for almost every indicator. So it applies to oral reading fluency as well. You can see the kids who are doing with typical growth, that 1 to 2 correct words per minute per week. And then you're looking at some kids who are doing far above that on a weekly basis. And of course, the kids who are doing well below that, if at all. So that's how you come up with patterns. But overall in this classroom, the pattern is that many kids are maintaining their weekly growth. It's typical, or they are outperforming. They're typically developing peers with above typical or well above typical growth. So that's pretty exciting for this class. Anything else that you'd want to point out about the kids in this class? So as a school psychologist, you're still under child find mandates, you're still under kind of helping people assess fidelity of their tiered system to make high stakes decisions if you're using an RTI approach. Is there a kid here that you might consider, you would be concerned about? They're sitting kind of in the emergency room in the hospital. And if so, who would that kid be and who would you want to do some problem solving around? Now this is over the course of a year, so we wouldn't wait that long, but let's pretend like this is beginning of year 2, you know, December-ish. Which kid is looking really needy? Or kids? You had to prioritize who would be first and who would be second.
We're getting a lot of Renata and Whitney.
Yeah, and who would you put first, Whitney or Renata, and why?
I'm seeing Whitney, then Renata.
Yeah, so you have Whitney, right, who's starting out in the beginning of first grade, well below benchmark, and her final status at the end of the year in first grade is also well below benchmark. So no matter what the indicator was, she evidenced below typical or well below typical growth from, in this case, fall to spring. And generally, when you average those, in most cases, she was evidencing well below typical growth. You compare her to academically like peers like Winford. There's no comparison there. Winford responded, right? He's academically like her. He had a much different response to core reading instruction and supplemental intervention at a tier 3 level. He evidenced above typical growth, typical growth, and he still has some work to do here on phoneme graphing correspondence. So he had a much different RTI. Let's look at Pearl, same thing. Started out well below typical at the beginning of the year, but ended up moving levels from well below benchmark to below benchmark. Now she didn't have the above typical growth that we wanted. She only had typical growth. She's like Jared in our former example, but she's headed in the right direction with some more problem solving and manipulation. And then Frida, we don't need to be as concerned about her. She had well above typical growth. Started out well below benchmark, and by the end of the year, ended up in the above benchmark, well above benchmark category or level, which we don't really see as much, but that's because she had well above typical growth. Really responded to core reading instruction and supplemental intervention. So that's what we want to do as school psychs or people who are facilitating data analysis around the health of a tiered system. We want to move people in this direction of saying, where are we in each grade level? Are we at 60%? We're 60% if we're running a 60-40 split at each benchmark assessment. Are we approximating the 80%? Are we seeing the 80% response in advanced tier support as well? Where does our tiered system need help? And in what areas can we help? Do we need to expand our continuum of evidence-based practices in the area of phonemic awareness? Do we need more comprehensive interventions, more powerful interventions? And we can get into conversations about where evidence-based practices fall on the continuum of intensity, because they're not all equal. So often we'll talk about pharmacies and we'll say, you know, we want to go down the aisle for some kids where we're tapping penicillin, if not going next door for neurosurgery. And then in other cases, we're looking at extra strength Tylenol being sufficient for some of these kids to realize above typical growth. But the point is to continue to expand your continuum of evidence-based practices and explicit up both core and supplemental intervention. And so Jack Fletcher's work is really about placing the understanding of when to pull the trigger, so to speak, moving to eligibility, proportionally speaking, on the child's final status from time 1 to time 2, a reasonable period of time. This is not reasonable. I mean, we wouldn't want to go a whole year before we look at post-intervention status. So fall to winter is a good time to be looking at some of these kids like Whitney, and making some decisions about child find and what's been in place for Whitney, as well as her academic-like peers, how many responded, how many didn't. Now, if everyone was like Whitney, I'd really have concerns about fidelity of tier 3, and then I also have to look at fidelity of tier 1. But this year in our series with our teams, you know, one of the issues was, well, we had COVID, and so we had different instructional conditions. And so that's why we were running an upside down triangle. That's why, you know, from fall to winter, we had 50 or 60 or 70% of our kids still performing below benchmark or well below benchmark from time 1 to time 2. And that's reasonable. However, when we went back and looked at the year before, when there were more typical instructional conditions for kindergarten, first and second grade students, it was the same percentage. So we understand COVID. What we want to do is help folks go back, look retrospectively at their patterns, and see if there really was a difference with COVID or not. And if you do go back to 1920 or winter of 1920, when they collected their winter benchmark data before COVID hit in March, where kids ended up in winter in that grade level based on the SGPs is pretty indicative of where kids left that grade level, even without March, April, and beginning of May instruction. So, and it's indicative of prior years, assuming it's the same teacher and that kind of thing. So going back and looking at those patterns can be really helpful with folks just to get a sense of the health of your tiered system. Where are we? Taking pause, and then revisiting continuous school improvement to see how we can continue to approximate the 80% marker, if not higher. So really the goal is 100% proficiency for all kids. 100% of K-1 students make it to benchmark, and benchmark is about the 35th percentile of reading achievement or higher. So let me just pause and get a sense of, do you feel like you could take what you've learned from this report even though it's an Acadience report, and extrapolate it to whatever system you're using. STAR, iReady, Dibble's 8th will have SGPs at some point. They're not quite there yet, but do you feel you can do that? Ames Web Plus, does this make sense to you?
We are getting a few yeses, and just a quick side note I put in the chat. People were having a hard time reading it. Karen got the end of year ones uploaded in the Google Drive, so you'll have a copy of example data. The one in there was middle of year, so it just was off a smidge. Getting a lot of yeses.
Good. So it takes some practice. I would say that when we run teams through this, to include the classroom teachers, the school psychologists, the reading specialists, special ed teachers, and administrators, we do this typically after they get their fall to winter SGPs and they've implemented something like ECRI, Enhanced Core Reading Instruction. They practice those routines to enhance core instruction. They've done some preview teaching of the ECRI routines, and the reading specialist has done some things at a tier 3 level with students who aren't responding just to ECRI and core alone. We'll look at these fall to winter SGPs, and then they go through them again, like those are coming up now. They'll go through them again in May. And I would say that after doing that twice and then anywhere in between, teachers have a pretty good understanding of the health of their tiered system. And that's what then catapults us into conversations about what do we currently have in our continuum of evidence-based practices, and what do we want to do next in terms of PD, or expanding that, or understanding the science of reading, or going deeper within phonics instruction, or understanding phonemic awareness, any of those things. So it can lead to all kinds of different directions. I am going to ask Erica to put an MTSS quick health check in the Padlet. I'm going to send that to you also. And let me just, I have a few minutes here and then we're going to take a break, but let me just show you what that looks like. So we'll close out this report. I will do a new share so you can see what I'm talking about. And this is what it looks like. So remember how we said if folks are at a 60-40 split from at the winter benchmark and then at the spring benchmark, if they're running like a 60-40 split, you're approaching moderate evidence of fidelity of your tiered system. If you're at that 80-20 split or better, we have strong evidence of fidelity of a tiered system. And so you can have your folks just quickly kind of answer these questions. At the school level, we're generally effective in improving outcomes. You might check the 60% evidence area if that's where you are. At the classroom level, we're generally effective. Again, you would choose. 95% of kids who are benchmark or proficient remain benchmark or proficient. Remember how we looked at that class, and 100% of the kids stayed benchmark or above benchmark. 80% of students are meeting benchmark or proficient status on time. I mean, we would definitely check this column if that were the case. Here's the tier 2, 80%. Here's the tier 3, 80%. So you can go through each of the kids in a classroom or at the grade level and use this particular chart. There's a little code there, and then you can answer these questions with your team. Based upon our quick health assessment, we'll consider explicit instructional design and delivery at core because the median student is performing below benchmark or below proficient. We'll consider looking at evidence-based practices. We'll consider goal setting and progress monitoring, which is a practice that, surprisingly still isn't in place uniformly across grade levels and in buildings. And then professional development on the science of reading, the science of math, or the science of behavioral and cell. So as you all know, the goal is to take high incidence problems and pretty much reduce them to nothing. And so for reading, these reports are really, really particularly healthy. Although you can use SGPs for math to assess the health of math instruction. And then for behavior, it's the same thing. 80% of kids are responding to classroom management, the overall social emotional health of the classroom, et cetera. 80% of kids are responding to what the classroom teacher is doing alone without the provisions of a tier 2 or tier 3 support in behavioral health. So that's just a quick little checklist, and I will send this to Erica to put in the Padlet. Any other questions? So we'll take a break a little bit early, and that'll give Karen some time to set up for the next part. But before we leave for break, any other questions or comments?
That resource is loaded on the Padlet. Just click the refresh button and it should pop up for you. I had it in my files from before.
You be the quintessential facilitator. Thank you. Okay. So why don't we take a break from 9:55 to 10:10, and we'll come back at 10:10. Okay.
One real quick question we can get, is there an expected timeline for SGPs from DIBELS 8 that we're aware of?
I do not know. We are in collaboration with University of Oregon a lot, and it's a matter of them taking the new measures that they've added to DIBELS 8 and getting norms on those in order to manifest the SGP. So it depends on many users. And I would think on average, we're looking at probably a 3 to 5 year kind of mark. So I would just say that without talking to them and getting confirmation of that, but that's what I would estimate. So we're in 2021. The hope would be, hopefully by 22, 23. But if I can get an answer to that, we'll get that out to the field. We'll let you know. Good question. All right, well, let's expand the break then. Let's go until 10:15. Okay, we'll give a few extra minutes to folks.
You don't need to log off. Just we'll let the Zoom run.
Thanks, Erica.
Erica, would you like me to start or would you like to open?
It is 10:15, so I think you're good to go ahead and start. I'll repost the Padlet link in for everyone.
Thank you. That is very helpful. Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Brady. I'm educational consultant at the Patton Harrisburg office, and I am the Central Region MTSS lead, and I work on the Literacy Initiative, and I'm glad to be joining you here today. Just to refresh where you can find the handouts and the resources for this session, as well as for this section of the presentation. Most of our time this morning was spent here in this PowerPoint file. We're now going to be moving into a lot of the handouts that you see here in this Google folder link. And then we are going to be having hopefully 2 breakout room activities today. And when we do those, you will be accessing those here at the breakout room activity. This here activity is not only here, but is also here as well, but it's fleshed out for you nicely here so you can find it. I know sometimes in breakout rooms, it's hard to find the materials, but Erica has organized this very nicely for us. So we should be good to go for today. So for the remainder of the afternoon, before we talk about application for school psychologists, we're going to be talking about Acadience Reading K-6 Pathways of Progress. We know that many Pennsylvania schools are using Acadience, and many on this call have been using Acadience as well. However, when we're thinking about goal setting, we can apply some of the things that we're learning here today to your systems. Pathways of Progress is unique, however, to the Acadience learning system. This is part of a larger workshop that Dr. Roland Good has presented for Patton and across the nation in the past. So we're just going to be kind of doing the tip of the iceberg here today. But I will just share with you some points, and then I'm going to share with you a little bit later how you can find that actual free workshop for him if you want to take things a little bit deeper. I know you may be interested in reliability and validity and those kinds of things, and those would be best addressed with looking at his workshop as a follow-up for today. So I'm going to start off today talking a little bit more specifically about the pathways of progress descriptors. Eric, are you able to take a look at those annotations for me, maybe clear those? That would be very helpful. So what you see here are the pathways of progress descriptors. And one of the things that I had noticed in the chat was someone wanted to know specifically for Acadians what those pathways percentiles were. And Jen gave us some really great general guidance that above 50 to 65 percentile, generally speaking, is considered to be above typical progress. But each system is going to have their own specific breakdown of how they look at their percentiles and how they determine what's well above typical, below, or well below typical. So Dr. Roland Good and his team with Acadians developed these pathways of progress, and he used a spline quintile analysis, which means that he divided his data set of 400,000 students across the nation in 14-15 school year and came up with these quintiles of percentiles. So to answer your question, what in Acadians, how do they define the percentiles? You'll find that the below the 20th percentile is well below typical progress, or that red star. The 20th to 39th percentile is below typical, or 2 yellow stars. And the 40th to 59th percentile is typical progress, or 3 green stars. The 60th to 79th is above typical, or 4 green stars. And that 80th percentile above is well above typical, or the 5 green stars. So Jen did a really nice job previously talking about individuals' student data and a global view of the system and the classroom. The section that I'm going to be talking about today is really going to be at the individual level. How do we set goals, and how do we look at progress monitoring data in relation to these pathways of progress? One of the things that we find when working with teams is that it's a little bit confusing with pathways because, you know, when we look at like rates of improvement, we're comparing data points to aim lines and trend lines. We're actually looking at the lines. You will see on eventually when we get to the individual progress monitoring graphs, you will see these yellow lines, light green lines, and blue lines, which are 4 lines, obviously. But the pathways are actually the spaces in between. So that's a little bit different than what we're used to seeing in the past. So anything below that yellow line is in that well below typical pathway. So the pathway is the space in between. Anything between the yellow and the light green is the yellow pathway. Anything between the 2 green lines is considered to be typical progress. Above typical will be between the green and the blue. And then the pathway 5 is actually above this line. So that's just a general overview as we're thinking about interpreting how these pathways are working, and then also what that might look like on a progress monitoring graph. So before we get into the actual progress monitoring graph, I want to spend some time today talking about goal setting. Then I will take you to the actual mock data set where we can practice goal setting together. And then we're going to talk about those data points in relation to those pathways in order to make those instructional decisions. So in Acadians, when we think about how do we have an effective individual student learning goal, there are 3 main things that Roland Good talks about. He talks about it needs to be meaningful, it needs to be ambitious, and it also needs to be attainable. We're going to be talking about meaningful for a good bit, and then we'll talk about ambitious and attainable. Before we do that, though, this is going to be in context of a student named Tabitha. And Tabitha is a 3rd grade student, And you can see most of her scores are falling in that strategic yellow below benchmark range. And you can see her initial skills in the fall for 3rd grade is actually showing that she has a high degree of accuracy. And we don't normally see that, or it's not maybe a usual category for students. But this student here is having difficulty with adequate rate and reading for meaning. And we can get that from looking at these scores. A 205 composite is a very strong predictor of overall reading achievement. The oral reading fluency, the ORF and the retell and the maze, which is a closed procedure, those all are in that strategic range or the below benchmark range with 96% ORF accuracy. And we know that in 3rd grade, we're approaching our benchmarks close to 98%. So this is a pretty good start for her as far as accuracy is concerned. So in order for a goal to be meaningful, that requires really 3 main things. We typically talk about students needing to be accurate. We need the students to have an adequate rate so that mental capacities are released for thinking about what's happening in the text and reading for meaning, okay? Roland Good explains that reading composite score is the most important goal, with goals for all of these 3 components, okay? Think of it like a stool with 3 legs. If one of those legs are not there, the stool will fall over. So these 3 things are important when we talk about making meaningful goals. So when we talk about a meaningful goal, what are the subcategories or subtests that we would use, or the measures that we would look at to determine if something is meaningful? And we have 4 main subtests that are can be considered really important when we're talking about reading for meaning. So we have oral reading fluency, or words correct per minute, which we know is a very strong indicator of reading for meaning. We know that's been documented in the literature for a really long time. We have the retell, which is going to share, how we read for meaning, and then the closed procedure as well. According to Roland Good, the best measure in his system that is correlated to reading for meaning is actually the composite score. And you note that Jen had talked about that when we talk about those setting student growth percentiles, and in this case, pathways of progress, that's going to be based on the composite score of the fall, looking at students. And in this case, it was 400,000 students who were performing in comparison. So students that performed around this beginning composite score, they would be looking at how students performed over time to determine those pathways. Again, a meaningful goal does address rate, and I think we're all familiar with oral reading fluency taking care of that for us as one particular measure of rate. And then we also want to look at the accuracy, or the ORF accuracy. And we need to have high levels of accuracy so that students, again, are fluent and then can attend to the meaning of the text. So meaningful goal includes not only meaning measures, the rate measures, and also accuracy as well. So a takeaway about a meaningful goal is that we want to make sure that we have a positive change for the future. And this is going to be particularly important when we set those goals. And when we get into that goal setting tool, you'll see that even though we set a meaningful, ambitious, and attainable goal, it may or may not mean that a student reaches the benchmark status. For each student, that we want to make sure that we're changing the risk status for the student in a meaningful way and increasing the odds that the student is going to reach outcomes on the next, positive outcomes on the next benchmark, but overall trajectory for the end of the year and beyond. So when we look at the initial status for meaningful goals, we typically think about setting goals for those students in that well below benchmark or that below benchmark stage. In particular, Roland Good has made it very easy for educators, teachers, reading specialists, school psychologists, and a problem-solving team to come together and make meaningful goals for all students. We won't have time to do that for an entire classroom today, but just know you do not have to just set goals in this system for those kids that are below benchmark. So let's take a look at this first example. Right, well, the second example. So here we have a well below benchmark student, and it's natural to think that we want to set an at or above benchmark goal. And based on using student growth percentiles and with the pathways of progress, we're going to be able to determine if this is the best meaningful goal for a well below benchmark student. For some well below benchmark students, or students whose scores fall in the well below benchmark range, the scores may be so deficient that a meaningful goal would get to the below benchmark range. It may take more than a year to get to that benchmark or above benchmark status. And I think we've experienced that in the past with other systems that we've had. If you have a student whose scores are falling in the below benchmark range, we want to take a look at setting a goal that's at the green, at or above benchmark. And for students that scores fall at the at benchmark range, setting a goal above benchmark certainly would be ambitious and maybe where you want to go, or you want to maintain the relative standing of at benchmark. Okay. So we want to make sure that our goals increase the odds of achieving those important literacy outcomes. We are going to be taking a look at this goal setting tool in a little while. And you can see that for each of these particular measures for a third grader in the system, and I'll be very specific when I demonstrate that, you'll see the beginning of the year scores, the composite score, and then you will see that on the right-hand side, we can look to the growth pathways to determine what the goal would be for the end of the year on each of these measures. Just to note, we can only set a goal for the measures that are measured in the fall, in the end of the year. So we look at fall scores and we would set goals for the end of the year using these pathways as a guide. In the examples that I will share with you, you'll see that there'll be first graders and there will be measures like LNF and PSF that are not measured at the end of the year. Therefore, we will not be able to set a pathway for those particular measures. You can do out of grade level monitoring for those students, but we will not be setting actual goals for those particular subtests. The next thing we need to think about when we're setting a goal is that not only is it meaningful, but we also want it to be ambitious, right? And we had said that Tabitha's scores are falling mostly in this yellow range, and her composite score is also in that yellow range or strategic range or that below benchmark range. So a student in that range, in order for it to be ambitious, we need to be looking at above typical progress or well above typical progress. And those are generally typically what we consider to be ambitious goals. We'll talk a little bit about what attainable means in relation to that. So establishing goals for students who are below or well below benchmark, those students who are not, for students whose scores are not in those ranges, we want to set goals that are ambitious. These two categories are considered to be ambitious. I can tell you that the sweet spot for those students is this above typical range. Remember that well above typical range, that 5 blue stars, is in the 80th to 99th percentile of growth. And we know that that is really ambitious and may not be attainable for all students. We want to have high expectations, but we also want them to be reasonable. And when we think about in the past setting goals, how many words correct per minute per week is ambitious, what is super ambitious? These pathways of progress really help to contextualize that conversation with your problem-solving team. So establishing goals for students who have scores that are at or above benchmark, okay? Ambitious for those students could be typical, above typical, or well above typical. So if you have a student whose scores are falling at the at or above benchmark range, and let's say they're at the 50th percentile of achievement, that typical range will maintain, generally speaking, their relative standing. So typical for a student who has scores at or above benchmark, typical could be just fine. They may get above typical growth and well above typical growth. Of course, we shoot for the stars, right? Or we shoot for 5 blue stars. But for those students, typical growth is okay, right? But it's not okay for those students who are not at or above benchmark. The next thing we need to think about when we're setting goals is we have something that's meaningful, we have something that's ambitious, but what is attainable, right? We have those conversations. What's too high? What's too low? The Goldilocks principle, what is just right? So attainable goals, we want the ones that are achievable for most of our students and for most educators. So all of these are attainable, right? We can attain well below typical or below typical progress, but that certainly isn't what we want for our students, right? We want things that are attainable, that make sense for kids. So again, a typical progress is attainable, above typical progress is attainable. This well above typical progress, you will see for some of our students, and in Jen's example, there were some kids that reached that goal, but it just may not be attainable for all of our kids. So for those students that we'll be talking about today, when we set our goals, those will be students whose scores are in the below benchmark range, and we are going to really look for this sweet spot of 4 green stars. One of the things that I want to share with you before I ask if you have any comments or questions is once you have that meaningful goal and we set those goals, you'll see that we can actually write a very measurable, comprehensive goal for this student, Tabitha. We have not only rate with words correct per minute, we will have a goal that includes accuracy, and we will have a goal that includes meaning. I know in my practice with my problem solving team, many times we would set a goal for oral reading fluency, or we might set a goal for accuracy, or we might set a goal for meaning. But when we think about goals in this system in particular, using the growth pathways of progress growth goals, we would have a comprehensive goal for a student like Tabitha. So I want to stop there and see if there are any questions in the chat before we transition to going over to actually doing some goal setting.
Okay, just giving folks a second if there's any questions, just a comment. Teachers approach their craft slightly or more differently, including goal setting for students. Nothing else popping up.
All right, well, thanks for your attention during that, and we'll go ahead and we'll move to how do we actually set goals for students. I do want to just share with you 2 resources that will help you if you want to, even if you're not an Acadience user and you want to play around with it, or if you're an Acadience user and you do not want to actually go in and practice with actual goal setting with your account. There is a demo account called Acadience. I'll show you how you can get to the actual site. But here is the username and the password, which is a demo account. And that's what I will be using today as I demonstrate with that mock 1A classroom that Jen shared with us earlier today, where she took that classroom view, looked at individual students. Now we're going to dig deeper for kids that do not fall in that benchmark range. I also want to share in this document, which is also in your handouts, if you're interested in that free training to dig into Pathways of Progress a little bit deeper than what we have time today, that link is available for you here as well. Okay. All right, so I am going to go to the Acadience data management system now. And like I said, you just Google acadiancelearning.net, and then you can go in and you can log in using those usernames and passwords that I provided for you all. So I'm going to go into the Acadience demo account, and the password I have just regularly in there, but you have that for your access. So I'm just going to log in here today and show you how you can actually access that, and we're going to set some goals together. So it may seem a little strange when we're talking about setting goals for individual students that you go into the data entry section, but that's where we're going to head today. And then you just click on Pathways to Progress Goal Setting. I am going to pick that Mockingbird Elementary School. I'm going to go to the 1920 school year, and I'm going to pick first grade, and I'm going to hit submit. Just so you know, as you're going in and you're practicing, or if you'd like to practice or take a look at this on your own, that not all of the data sets are created equal. I just happened to pick one that I know had some good data in it, and so that I can use that for demonstration purposes for today. So if you just want to write down, if you want to go back in at some point, Mockingbird Elementary School 1920, first grade, mock grade 1A, in case you want to go in there and just kind of practice on your own. So here you're going to see those students that Jen was talking about. And you can see Delphine already has a goal set for her. I'm going to go scrolling down to, I'm going to do two demonstrations today. I'm going to do one that I think we talked about, which was Winford, right? Now, I believe if they think about how Winford performed really, really well by the end of the year. But this is the beginning of the year, so we want to back up to the fall. We have our fall data set, and we do need to set goals in the fall, and we can set those from fall. So we'll set the goals from the fall to the end of the year. However, like Jen said, you can pull up the student growth percentiles by class by student at the winter and the spring. The reason we want to set these goals, obviously, is so that it can help us to interpret our progress monitoring data and determine how the student is falling in comparison to hundreds of thousands of other students that started with a similar composite score of here. And then also you will see pathways and goals on your progress monitoring data that's already pre-populated onto your progress monitoring graphs. So that's a really nice feature that we will see here. So for Winford, again, we're saying we have a first grader, and in the fall, you'll see the measures or indicators that are included in the fall screening. And you'll see that the beginning of the year scores. So we know that letter naming fluency and phoneme segmentation fluency is not measured at the end of the year. Remember where I said we were going to see that? We won't be able to set pathways for those two measures. However, you can see that the student has not quite reached what we would like to see. You could still progress monitor at a grade level, no problems. You can create those graphs, but we'll also want to be looking at how the student is doing in relation to grade level peers, grade level status, and also how students are performing compared to students that started out like Winford. Okay, so if we look at the scores here, I'm going to just kind of skip over these, not that they're not important, but for goal setting for this situation, we have a score of 12, which is open, which means that's well below. And we have the one whole words red, which is considered just below. The benchmark is actually 1 for first grade. I'm sorry, this is actually solid, which means it is a benchmark score. So you just click on the Pathways of Progress, and you'll see that you get this goal setting feature. And if I click on here, and right now there's nothing filled in, You can sit down. We recommended to sit down as a problem-solving team, especially for those tier 3 students that are students who are in tier 3, who you will be really focusing on in a more frequent manner with the families and other stakeholders for the student. So what you have are the pathways from well below typical all the way to well above typical. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see the ranges of scores or the endpoints for the end of the year that would fall in those pathways. Okay. This right here is sort of like a middle score right down the middle. This is a kind of like a guide, but as a problem-solving team, you have the context of the student, the instructional diet, any health influences, any family influences that might play into your thinking about how you want to set goals. Generally speaking, and honestly, I don't know Winford, so I'm just going by numbers. With a student whose scores are falling below benchmark, remember we said the sweet spot was right here. If we just get typical progress, we're not going to see the growth that we need to see by the end of the year. So I'm going to shoot here, and I'm just going to click on, I'm going to look at this above typical progress. By the way, in your handouts are the benchmarks for the cadence in case you're not familiar. However, if you work with them frequently, you may realize that you might have them memorized. So for nonsense word correct letter sounds, the end of the year goal is 58 correct letter sounds. I could set the goal there, but that's like the minimum level of okay for our students. It's under the 40th percentile of achievement. We're not setting the world on fire. And I'm going to look at this above typical range, and I'm going to say, I want to put this student on a stronger path of proficiency. So above typical range, we know it's 58. You might decide to go with 60. Again, this is a determination of your problem-solving team. And once you do that, it'll tell you how the student will be performing if they reach that goal based on the end of the year benchmarks. And a solid square is considered to be at or above benchmark. I'm pretty good with that. And you know why I'm good at that? Is I know compared to students like Winford, that other students, thousands of students who started off like this, when they were getting above typical progress, scored like that. And I feel like that's ambitious. I feel like that's meaningful. And I do feel like it's attainable. It's not, setting it too high. So I'm going to hit enter on that. And you can go in and change these. So it's not like once you do this, it's once and done. Now we look at whole words read. I know from working in the system that the goal for whole words read is 13. Okay, 13 falls right in here. You might decide to hit, maybe that 16 or that 17. I am going to show you what happens if you would choose a typical progress goal for this student. If I go ahead and put, let's just say 14 there, and we'll look at what happens overall. Okay, let's take a look at oral reading fluency. We know that the benchmark for oral reading fluency is 47. I look over here, my first peak is at that above typical progress. 47 falls in there. I feel really good about that goal. It's above typical, it's ambitious, it's attainable, and it's going to be meaningful, moving the student to a higher status as far as reading proficiency. I could do 47, I could do 52. I'm going to put 52, going to go a little bit higher, not 32. Go a little bit higher than just what the minimum standard is. You might decide for Winford that 47 is just fine, depending on what you know about the student. I'm also going to look at oral reading fluency. Accuracy, 90% is the benchmark goal for oral reading fluency for the end of first grade. I see that falls in that above typical range. Maybe you want it, maybe 90 is just where you think, Winford might end. I'm going to pick 92 because it's right in the middle. The more accurate, the better. And when I do that and I click return, I get an overall goal. So I see from this goal that I have 4 green stars but this is going to put this student in the just the below benchmark range. I'm not necessarily happy with that. I think I'm going to go back and I'm going to increase this here to the above typical range. We said that it was 58 and 13. I'm going to try to maybe do 17 and let's see what happens there. When I do that, I get 4 green stars, which is in the above typical progress. And I have a solid square here, putting that student in that achievement, the benchmark achievement range. Okay. Any questions about goal setting with Winford? We have an ambitious goal, we have an attainable goal, and we have one that will put the student on the path of proficiency. So maybe in the chat, what we can do is on a scale from 1 to 3, where 1, I don't feel comfortable with setting goals with pathways of progress. 3, I feel like I can go ahead and do that tomorrow, or 2, I need more practice. 1, 2, or 3.
Okay, we're seeing mostly 2s. I gotta love our school psychologist, a 2.5. A couple 3s in there. Mostly 2s and 3s. Probably an average rating of 2.33.
All right, awesome. So I just would like to go through that process just one more time. I won't spend as much time as I did on the last one because I know you guys are really proficient at goal setting, but I do want to share with you, remember we talked about a meaningful goal, that sometimes a student who is well below benchmark may not get to that benchmark status, and that still might be meaningful for the student. So I'll do this a little bit more quickly with our student Artie, who is in the well below benchmark range. We have, the scores are in the well below benchmark range, and we can see that we have below benchmark, we have well below benchmark, and we have below benchmark scores with a composite score, which is in the well below benchmark range. So I'm going to go here to start with that correct letter sounds with the goal of 58. I know that 58 falls in this above typical range. I feel good. I feel confident that with the intense, robust, and intervention diet that we have for Artie, the family is wrapping themselves around Artie, and there's a nice communication between tier 1 and tier 2 or tier 3 that we can make this goal. So I am going to pick, I think 58 here. All right, and I see that when I do that, I am one of the scores would fall in that benchmark range. Here we have a situation here where 13 is the goal. 13 is within that above typical progress range. Feel pretty good about that. I think I'm going to put 13 there. Could do 15, but I'm going to go for 13. And here we have oral reading fluency, words correct. Okay, we know that 47, okay, 47 is the benchmark. I really would like to set the goal at benchmark, but I know that that is well above typical. That's in the 80th to 90th percentile of achievement. Sorry, 80th to 90th percentile of growth. That might not be attainable. So I think I'm going to set the higher limit here of above typical. I'm going to go for 45. So that is still an ambitious, attainable, and meaningful goal for this student. And then the last one is the accuracy. We know the benchmark is 90. If I look at where that falls, it's still in the above typical range. It's still attainable, still ambitious. I think I can put 90 there. Again, this is a decision that the problem-solving team will make together. So here we have an ambitious, attainable, meaningful goal. And here's an example where we do not get to benchmark status, right? But that is still catapulting that student forward, moving towards that benchmark status. And that is still a meaningful goal for this student, Artie. Moving from a student whose scores are falling in this well below benchmark range to approaching benchmark. So you as a problem-solving team would think about that. Great. I'd like for you all just to kind of reflect on that process and, you know, in your thoughts about a meaningful goal where it just might not be benchmark status.
And we did have a quick question, Karen.
Yep.
So in the chat, a question came up. Where do the default numbers come from that show up next to the ranges? And is that considered a starting point until you're able to sit down as a team and talk about the individual student?
Okay, so the ranges here, so I think what we're talking about here, let me just open it up. I think we're talking about these ranges right here. I believe those would be what Roland Good has determined are the endpoints that would get you to this above typical progress. And yes, those ranges are sort of, you know, where your problem solving team would look at. They even go ahead and pick the middle score for your consideration, but it's really a contextual conversation between, you know, the problem solving team and the family as you're doing that.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Any other thoughts or questions before we move out of the system and talk about really exciting things around data points and the pathways on progress monitoring graphs? All right, looks like we're ready to roll with some more. All right, so again, we're back into that big handout if you're following along. And I'm just going to move us down now to 91 on here. And so to get us to the right spot. So once you set that goal, you will have, there will be a star that shows up where your goal is. And for, this is Tabitha again. And when we looked at Tabitha, she would have performed at the benchmark range. So her goal would be right here. So once you do set that, you will get a goal that is shown there. When we're talking about interpreting data points in relation to the pathways, Roland Good uses a median of 3 most recent data points. So you can see this looks like it's a front of a booklet and the pathways are drawn here. Once you set the goal in that pathways in the data system, your progress monitoring graph, once you check show pathways, the pathways will be automatically there for you. The goal will be automatically there for you. It's not a matter that you have to draw these pathways, certainly not. So what you see here, this is an oral reading fluency example, and this is the beginning of the year. Now we're kind of skipping back to our 3rd grade example for Tabitha. She had 65 words correct per minute in September. And then you can see that there are 3 progress monitoring data points: 74 words correct per minute and 3 errors, 71 and 2, 68 and 1. And you can see up here, the first score of 74 falls in the pathway of progress 3. Remember, we talked about that it's a little different than what we're used to. We're not looking at the lines per se. We're looking at the spaces in between when we get to this chart. So anything below the yellow is considered well below typical. Anything between the yellow and the green is considered below typical. In between the greens is typical. Green and blue is above typical. And above this is well above typical progress. So when we look at that first data point is in pathway 3. You can kind of extrapolate it out. The second one, 71 and 2, is in pathway 2. And the third data point, 68 and 1, is in pathway 3. So we can see that what we have here is the 3 data points. We have a median of 3. So what you would do is you would take out the high, you would take out the low, and you would look at the middle data point. The middle data point here is pathway 2. So in the median pathway of progress 2, we would not feel like that was enough or adequate growth there. So I'm going to move ahead here, and we're going to see that we have another data point that is here. So if once we add another data point, remember it's a moving median of the 3 most recent data points. So when we add the third one, we kind of disregard this one. That's why it's here in black. Okay. So we're going to start here looking at these 3. We're going to take away the high, which is the 72. We're going to take away the low, which is the 68. And we're still at pathway 2. We're going to continue to progress monitor. Whoops, let me go back. Sorry about that. We're going to continue to progress monitor, and we have another data point here, which is 81 and 4. We go ahead and plot that data point, or the system does. We take away, now you see we're looking at these 3 median data point, or three data points, the most recent ones. We disregard this one. We take away the high, we take away the low. The median is right here in pathway 2. We're highly encouraged by this data point, but we don't really have a stable trend. So we're going to continue to progress monitor. Okay. The next data point is 88 with 5 errors. And when we plot that data point, you can see that this one is blocked off as black, right? So we take a look at the 3 most recent data points. We take away the high, we take away the low, and now we have the median is falling here, right? Pathway 4. Remember, that's our sweet spot. We're feeling really good here that we're beginning to see a stable trend in the data, and that we are able to determine that the intervention diet is working well. Okay, having some technical difficulties here. What you'll see here is we would have another data point that's not showing up here. I might have to, here we go, good, it came back. We have another data point here, and you can see that it falls right here. This one here does not, we don't look at this data point anymore. We look at the median of the 3. We take away the high, we take away the low, and we're finding that the median data point is falling in this 4th pathway. Okay, so this helps us, enables our decision making about our data in relation to what's happening with the student now in the relative present in the last 3 weeks. So this is an example of how you can use those data points in relation to the pathways to determine that is your barometer, right? That is, do we have enough robustness? Do we need to robust up more? Or are we going to stay the course in our data set? So this is a really positive trend in the data. When we have data points that are falling down here, right? Students that are intractable, that's when we really have some concerns. And obviously, if we have students whose scores are falling in here, it certainly is not enough to catapult them out of that below benchmark range. So before we go into our breakout rooms, Erica, I just want to see if there are any questions around this.
I'm not seeing any questions. Jen put an additional resource in the chat. So I will upload that to the Padlet while people are in breakout rooms. Okay. So Erica, I made a little switch in the sequence. So we'll start off with the first breakout room, and we'll see what kind of time we have for the second. Okay. So I'm going to just I'm going to show you what we're going to do next with the activity. And let me move up to the beginning. So if we could please just put this link into the chat, at least to the Padlet, so people can access that, that would be very helpful. So we're going to start off with this goal setting example.
We're going to start off with page 1. We're going to have a breakout for 15 minutes. And in that time, I'm going to ask for you to work individually as well as come together as a group. Okay. What we'd like you to do is look at Ethan's data on the left-hand side. If you need to look at the benchmark goals to help with your decision making, they're there for you. We'd like you to answer questions 1 through 4, and then actually go through and practice that goal setting feature for whole words read, for or words correct, for oral reading fluence accuracy. And then you can take those numbers and you can actually go ahead and put them in here. Okay. So we're going to start off. It's 11:02. We're going to come back at around 11:20. So what we'd like you to do is take a look at this, go to your breakout room, introduce yourself with your other colleagues, say hello. You have the ability to share your screen. You can pull up this, go ahead and work on this on your own. You can have a little piece of paper, you can write down your answers. And then after about 8 minutes, come back and have a conversation with your group as to what you put in that form. So any questions about what we're going to do in the breakout room? We're going to pull up this activity sheet that Erica has put up. We're going to work introduce ourselves to our breakout room folks, work independently for about 8 minutes, and then come back in your breakout room and discuss what you had, and then we'll have a whole group discussion. Okay. All right, Erica or Connor, I think we're ready to go.
If you haven't done breakout rooms, you'll get a little thing that pops up and invites you to join a breakout room. And go ahead and join that. I'm going to pause recording for a few minutes while people are in breakout rooms.
Okay, Erica, I think we have everybody back now. We have around 100 participants, and hopefully you found that breakout room and conversation be super meaningful when thinking about how to set goals for a student like Ethan. I have some filled in handout here that's just a possible solution. There is no right or wrong answer. So if we look at this student, end of year benchmark, is the student going to need support? Yes. Reading skills that are particular concern, the alphabetic principle as indicated by this correct letter sounds and whole words read. We didn't do an ORF measure at this time, but not able to read basic CVC words with unitization, being able to read them as whole words. So those are general needs. You might have said that letter naming fluency is a relative strength. We don't have benchmarks for that, but we kind of look for that 40 by the end of kindergarten. So that's probably debatable. But which pathway of progress would appropriately be ambitious and attainable for Ethan, right? Well above typical would be ambitious, but it just might not be attainable. And possibly you picked that above typical example. We looked at correct letter sounds, and I'm hoping that everybody can, let me just make this a little bit bigger so that you can see. For correct letter sounds, this person, we filled this in at 61. We just kind of picked that above typical range. 58 is the benchmark. We thought that was ambitious and attainable. Maybe you have something close to that or different. Here, 13 is the benchmark. This group picked 17 because it was in the above typical range and is attainable. You might have had another number there, depending on the context of the student or what your conversation was. 47 is the benchmark, which is in that above typical range. Could have picked 44, but thought, well, let's try to get to that minimum level of okay of 47, and then 90. 90 was smack right in the middle there and is the benchmark status. So in this case, 90 was the choice. Again, there is no exact right or exact wrong answer. It's really what the problem solving team feels, keeping in mind that if we want to move the student whose scores are falling below benchmark, that this is the sweet spot, the above typical range. Then you can take those scores and you can do a comprehensive written goal. This is particularly really important for your tier 3, for students who are in that tier 3 range, and also for students who are receiving special education services. And you can see it's comprehensive with accuracy, rate, and not meaning this time, but these are indicators of meaning in the first grade. Any thoughts or responses to that particular activity that you did in that breakout room? Did you have something similar? Why don't you go ahead and put a 1 if you had something similar to this in your discussion, a 0 if it was something completely different. All right, thank you.
Lots of 1s.
That's good. We want folks to be on track with that. All right. If you would want to do this activity with folks in your building, there's also a way that you can take a look at actually drawing aim lines and putting data points on there. The last thing I want to talk about is just to refresh our memories with this median of 3 data points. Here is Jacqueline. This is another student who is in 3rd grade, and you can see she's got these data points here. She has those progress monitoring data points. And when we would look at the median of those 3 data points, right, that moving median, we're going to look at the most recent. We take away the high, we take away the low, and you would find that this is pathway 4. If we would go through the activity, which I don't think we have time to do, and we would use a progress monitoring score of 80, and I'm going to use my annotate feature here. I'm not seeing it. Did we disable that?
Oh. No, if you click your view options at the top, the little caret, can you see it?
Yep, we're good. Got it. Perfect. So if I would pick 80, which would be 80, which is what the activity asks us to do, and we put our X right there, right? So now we have the median of these 3 data points. We take away the high, we take away the low, and we're still in pathway 4. So Jacqueline is on the path of proficiency, making that above typical progress. So this activity would take you through exactly what I just showed you in the little bit of time that I had to gather with that. So this pretty much ends my section on goal setting and progress monitoring using data points and using the moving median. Unless there are any questions that are coming up in the chat, I'm going to kick it off to the next person. I believe that will be Jen and Gina. So I will stop sharing my screen and you can take it away.
So I think we're just debriefing a little bit, so you have a chance to, we just wind things up here. And the question is, so what are your takeaways at this point? If you just want to put them in the chat box. We've covered how to assess the health of the tiers. We've covered goal setting. Sorry about that. We covered goal setting. What are your takeaways at this point? And, you know, relative to where you currently are in terms of your role and function, what might this mean for you? Or what do you hope it might mean for you? Because after all, you are all change agents. So how will you use this information in your current role and function?
So a few things are starting to pop in. Learning how to interpret data. I hope I can take the information to our admin team and become more active in planning tier 2 and 3 for students to help guide instruction. Like to see fewer kids get referred for testing, be able to better meet their needs through the general education curriculum, setting appropriate goals, making recommendations for improving goal planning as well as progress monitoring. Setting more meaningful goals using not just one skill, but a variety in one goal. We have some IU consultants joining us to help be able to support their LEAs, helping to move the pre-referral process to more of an MTSS approach and making database decisions, setting good goals, helping teachers be more systematic using pathways of progress for specific areas as well as SGPs. The end of year spring benchmark data to help drive the formation of intervention groups in the fall. Lots of great things popping in. I'm having a hard time keeping up.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
Really incredible. Wow. So many implications. I think it's so empowering. I mean, this has been our experience. It's so empowering to have a group of your leadership team, basically, with your advanced tier providers, reading specialists, your administrators, teachers, be able to look at these reports and be able to make informed decisions about the practices. Because after all, none of this matters unless you get to the practices. And so anyway, if you can serve in that capacity, that's just phenomenal, phenomenal. We just wanted to share a couple of things, and Gina's going to cover some highlights of the National Center on Improving Literacy website in a minute here. I do want to let you know, since the inception of Pennsylvania's Multitiered System of Support Initiative, which was about, I don't know, we're probably in our 12th or 13th year now, we had decided when IDA authorized RTI as an alternative to ability achievement discrepancy within a comprehensive evaluation, Pennsylvania decided that we would spend a lot of time on increasing the health and sustainability with folks around their tiered systems before we enter into the land of using RTI for SLD determination, even though we did coexisting training, you know, to that end. But if you're not aware, we had a process in place, the Bureau did, where folks completed an application submitting, well, in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 documents supporting fidelity of their multi-tiered system of support in order to make high stakes decisions. And so in order to make things easier and more accessible for schools and school psychologists who'd like to replace ability achievement discrepancy with RTI, they've changed the process. So if you go to this link, and actually, I'm just going to get out of this and show you because I think this will be easier for you anyway. If you go to the patent website and you click on multi-tiered systems of support, you'll get a drop-down menu. And if you click on response to intervention, it'll pop right up. And it says RTI for SLD determination fidelity tool. It comes in a Word document and a PDF, but the goal is, and the directions are here, the goal is to basically walk through
Jen, do you want us to see your fidelity tool?
Yeah, I'm trying to get down to the bottom of this here. There it is. Let me just hit share screen so you can see this. Can you see it?
You're looking good.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is what it looks like. And what the Bureau is asking now is that you basically form a team with cross-disciplinary representation, and you walk through this document and you rate on a Likert scale under each component of the framework what you have in place. Is it not implemented, somewhat implemented, or fully implemented? So it's basically a dialogue. And people really discuss the ins and outs, the nitty gritty, you know, the devil's in the detail kind of stuff around their multi-tiered system of support. And then essentially you submit this form to the Bureau, to Shannon I, who's the contact, and those directions are up here. And you'll get feedback from the Bureau then that you're good to go in terms of putting RTI in your special ed plan. So if you're interested in that, we just wanted to let you know it's a new process. It's an easier process. It's accessible. You don't have to be perfect. So we talked today about, you know, running a 60-40 split. You're approaching effectiveness, 80% meeting benchmark on time being, you know, sort of the synchronon of a healthy model. But in any case, knowing that school improvement is continuous, and we think that this is a good way to go. If you want more information about the validity and reliability of RTI as an approach, you can look at Dr. Fletcher's synopsis. He goes through all the different methods, ability achievement, PSW, RTI, and talks about the strengths and weaknesses and the reliability and validity based on, you know, 20, 30 years of research in that synopsis. But take a look at this tool. If you don't even go in this direction for SLD and you just want to do it for good review of your multi-tiered system of support and engage a team of people in that, it's good for that too. So really all the above. So thanks for bearing with me as I got to our website, but it's probably more accessible through the website anyway than the PowerPoint. And so Gina, I think I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you. And I will stop sharing.
Share. Can you see the patent website? I think you wanted me to share the Literacy Hub with everyone today because that's a brand new resource. So the link is on the slide, but I just wanted to show you if you go to the patent site, and can you see my patent site? Okay, so it's scrolling because it is new, it's scrolling here. So I wanted to just show you this, but you can also go to it through MTSS and then click literacy. But here it is, the Patent Literacy Resource Hub. And I just want to highlight a couple things. This is an amazing resource that, like I said, is pretty new. And I think one of the best things about it is that if you missed the literacy symposium earlier this year, you can access everything here. And I understand too that as you click on these different strands, there's actually a facilitation guide as well. So this is just amazing amount of information that in your spare time, if you want to access any of these awesome resources, you can do so through this hub. And in addition to the literacy symposium, we also have access here at the very bottom. If you go down to these snippets and the quick picks. And I know these are really popular. The quick picks are 30-minute videos. You can click here and choose different topics that you would be interested in. And then the snippets, which are also very popular. And again, quick because you don't have a lot of time. 3 to 5 minutes, different topics, wonderful information, and quick, easy way to access these or to share these even at a meeting. So I just wanted to show those and highlight that. And hopefully you'll have a little time to just explore this amazing resource and share it, because it's just unbelievable. I haven't even had a chance to see everything yet. I wanted to go back to these patent reads, but do yourself a favor and check out the snippets, the pics, and anything from the symposium. Did I forget anything, guys?
That was great, Gina. Thank you. We also want to mention the National Center on Improving Literacy, which is NCIL, NCIL, and they have updates about where dyslexia policy is across the country, where every state is relative to screening, benchmark assessments, progress monitoring, anything you'd want to know about dyslexia is there. At this point, the goal of NCIL is to make science of reading practice accessible to everybody, all stakeholders, families, school psychologists, teachers, reading specialists, you name it, accessible and ready to implement literally the next day. There's also a site on the NCIL website called KidZone, where teachers can help families help kids do reading, writing, listening, and speaking activities matched to need. So, you know, we're always looking to meaningfully engage and empower families. And as long as kids have access to the internet, it's free, and we could be prescriptive as problem-solving teams about activities that kids can do at home to bolster what's being offered in terms of instruction intervention at school. So check out the NCIL site. Right now it's elementary oriented, but it is intended to be a K-12 repository of evidence-based practices matched to the science of reading. And lastly, in the PowerPoint, I just have a link there for you to our Enhancing Early Literacy Outcomes live binder. When you open that, it's a little bit daunting. You know, there are like many tabs, but underneath each tab, you'll get a sense of what the teams accomplish. There's a lot of evidence-based practice information in there, a lot of science of reading knowledge in there, and that too can be a helpful resource for teams. So we wanted you to have access to that, and you can share it with anybody you want. So that is free and accessible to all. And so I think, Erica, that brings us to a close today. We want to thank you all for your participation and engagement. It was such a, it's such an honor to be with colleagues, fellow school psychologists, and keep at this whole reading issue. So thanks for your hard work and your dedication to the field. We certainly appreciate, above all, probably more than anyone, everything that you do. So thank you for joining today. Thanks, Erica.